some ancient Ethiopians used the form in the consecration, "This bread is my body," but all theologians admit this is invalid. And so just because things were used in certain areas of the ancient church, that doesn't mean it's acceptable. For instance, St. Cyprian, he was a saint, but he and the African bishops would also rebaptize the people who had come from heretics because they didn't believe heretics could validly baptize. Does that mean that that's acceptable? No, it doesn't. And so it would be specious to cite that as if it's acceptable just because it was done in one area of the early church. Likewise, Tertullian would say that you shouldn't baptize people till they grow up. Well, obviously that's not Catholic teaching. And there were many other things that were done in the early church which were not necessarily accepted by the universal church, and especially ancient texts which have been corrupted over time, as Pope Benedict XIV specifically addresses in Ex Quo. Now, as far as some of the other points that need to be mentioned, you had obviously had no response whatsoever to the quotes I gave from Pope Benedict XIV, St. Alphonsus. You said you'd direct people to look at them. Yeah, I would too, and that's why I quoted them. But you obviously, just like the heresies I brought up in the last debate, you had no response to them. You have no response to that. All you have is to continue on with your irrelevant private interpretation of Scripture. And what's amazing is the audacity that you have to continue to assert that the words in a passage of Scripture must necessarily qualify as a valid form of consecration, even though St. Thomas Aquinas specifically addressed that issue and contradicts what you're saying. And what you're saying contradicts all of these other authorities. It doesn't even give you one bit of pause whatsoever. And you say that the Council of Florence and Pope St. Pius V do not favor what we're saying at all. Well, that's clearly ridiculous. They identify the long form as the form, and the Council of Florence says you must have the form. Okay. Do you want to ask a question now, or I would like to go have some more time to do what we're doing with the 4-minute periods.
Sure. I want to go ahead and respond to that first, or we can do that in the next section if you'd like. I want to go ahead and respond to that, though.
All right. Well, if you're going to respond, then I get at the same time. So.
No problem.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. As we can clearly see, I guess Mr. Diamond can't deal with formally defined texts. He says that I'm a Protestant still. It's interesting. I could have sworn I worship at a Catholic church. But anyhow, according to him, I'm a Protestant because I have a private interpretation of certain biblical texts. You know, unfortunately, Mr. Diamond, it's not my interpretation. If you've got a problem, you go fight with the Council of Trent, not with me. But anyhow, he tells me that I don't respond to any of the quotations he's made in regard to Alphonsus, Benedict, and a number of individuals. It isn't that I'm not responding. It's that I'm disagreeing with his interpretation. I think it's ridiculous. These individuals are not referring to all. They're referring to all in the sense of universalism. That has nothing to do with the Novus Ordo. It's silly, and I'm not going to get into a little silly food fight over quotes that he simply doesn't understand. If he can't touch upon even one verse of Scripture, how can we view this individual with Peter Diamond as a competent witness? He's not at all. Anyhow, I don't see how he keeps bringing up corrupted texts over and over. And if this has nothing to do with the topic of Ephraim, who does use this formula that includes for all, do people speak against Ephraim and this very passage? They don't. This very passage was read in churches, not only in his area, but in churches all around the Catholic world. And Jerome is a witness to that. If Mr. Diamond would like, we can take a little break, and he can Google it, and he can look up the fact that this verse was used in many places. This verse is never spoken out against, and as such, we hope that maybe sometime in the future, Mr. Diamond, with this, we hope that he can also deal with the fact that Trent, not myself, have formally defined Matthew 26, Luke 22, and 1 Corinthians 11:23. Moving onwards. In my opening statement, I listed 3 pillars that Mr. Diamond was going to have to knock down in order to win the debate. I suppose that he would knock down just one. It would show a flaw in my whole position and maybe give him some justification for his arguments. So far, we've seen his arguments are lightweight, lack any theological reflection, and are nothing on the scholarly level. But that brings me to my next point, and that is a pillar of tradition, namely the patristic tradition in regards to the words of consecration. If the argument for many is needed to bring about a valid consecration, and if it were a valid argument, then surely we'd see some trace of this argument found amongst the early fathers. Unfortunately, when we examine the fathers, an overwhelming consensus notify us that this is my body and this is my blood, or this is the chalice of my blood, are all that is needed to bring about a valid sacrament. I'll read a few for you. Justin Martyr, and you know what, we hope that Peter Diamond can deal with these, tells us the food which is blessed by the prayer of his word is the flesh and blood of that Jesus who was made flesh. And what is this all-important blessing? Well, Justin tells us that it consists of the anamnesis, and this is my body, and this is my blood. Ambrose tells us that another nature comes after Christ proclaims, this is my body, and after he calls the blood, his blood, its nature is changed. Athanasius tells us that Christ changed the typical for the spiritual, and he says he did this by saying, this is my body, and this is my blood. Chrysostom tells us that once a priest says, this is my body, what is before him is transformed. He also says the same for the new covenant in my blood. Cyril of Alexandria tells us Christ said, indicating, this is my body, and this is my blood, in order that you might not judge what you see to be a mere figure. The same formula as what brings about the valid sacrament is echoed by Ephraim, Gregory of Nyssa, John of Damascus, Irenaeus, Tertullian, and numerous others. Again, any father that mentioned for many, or even for all for that matter, never viewed these words as having any importance in the consecration formula. The times for many appears, it is always when a verse of Scripture, either Mark or Matthew, is being directly quoted. In other words, it is not telling us that these words are necessary to effectuate the consecration. And I think it is ridiculous that Peter Diamond continues avoiding not only formally defined texts of Scripture, but it'll be interesting seeing how he deals with the patristic texts that I've put forth.
Okay, my response. Yeah, much of what you said is simply untrue. It's just like you said in the last debate that many of the fathers taught sola fide, faith alone, which is completely untrue. You state these things without any specific references at all, and you just throw them out there. But furthermore, as I pointed out earlier, it was the common practice in the ancient church to remove the words of consecration in liturgical books with the understanding that they would be said. This was known as the discipline arcana, okay, or the secret discipline. And so, just because it's not in a particular ancient book doesn't prove your point. This has already been covered. And in fact, the Salmanticenses, a group of theologians in the Middle Ages, specifically addressed this point at length. And they pointed out how all of these, or many of these, ancient liturgies, especially in the eastern part of the church, were corrupted. There are many things that are attributed to fathers of the church in texts which they never said. Anyone who has studied the early church fathers knows that there are many questionable texts floating around. Just like the second letter attributed to Clement is of questionable authority. And so to cite these things, and not all of those fathers said, this is my body, this is my blood, is all you need. That's simply untrue. But furthermore, even if it were true, it wouldn't make any difference, because we have the papal magisterium, which has told us that it's not just, this is my body, this is my blood. It says that it's all of the words, including for you and for many unto the remission of sins. You also make the completely irrelevant argument. You say Trent says these passages of Scripture express the real presence. I agree. Or so what? And I would like you to cite the specific passage, and if we examined it, we could see how ridiculous your argument is. That's irrelevant. It didn't say that those passages of Scripture in and of themselves constitute valid forms of consecration. So for you to say that Trent says that they deal or refer to the real presence, that's completely irrelevant. So you can say it all day long. It proves nothing. Secondly, you say that the quotes that I bring forward from St. Alphonsus, St. Thomas, the Catechism of Trent, and Pope Benedict XIV, that's quite an array against you, that they're only referring to all in the sense of universalism. Completely wrong. They're addressing whether all is proper. They're addressing whether the word is proper, okay? And they're saying, no, it's not proper, because all would express that it's for everyone, and it's not for everyone. And so what you are saying there is simply untrue. And you talk about none of the fathers say many is necessary. Completely untrue. For instance, St. Ambrose, and this is quoted by St. Thomas in the Summa, in his work on the sacraments, St. Ambrose says that the words of consecration is affected, it comes about, through the words of the Lord. And the words of the Lord, which affect the consecration, we know from the Council of Florence, are all of the words, including shed for you and for many unto the remission of sins. And furthermore, St. Thomas basically takes the best of the fathers. He culls what is most precious in the Fathers. That's what he's known for. He's not infallible, but that's what he does in his work. And he obviously believed all of these words were necessary, drawing upon what he saw in the Fathers of the Church. But the absurdity of what you're saying is shown by the fact that, and I would like you to address this, would you say that the Catechism of Trent, or would you say that St. Thomas Aquinas was wrong when he said that the Gospel accounts are not sufficient forms of consecration? Was that a wrong statement? And you can address that in your response. Your turn.